All right, boys and girls, we're going to talk about ordered pairs. And I'm sure this is something that is fairly new to everybody. If you've been at school, we've seen some of these on some of the homework packets. In fact, we've seen a lot of these on the homework packets, so they might be pretty close to, or it might look familiar to you. I guess let's just say that. But if you've been at home, there's a chance that maybe you haven't seen this, so this could be a brand new lesson. First off, on this page, I'm showing you what's called a coordinate grid or a coordinate plane. Coordinate grids basically are obviously looks like a grid, but the reality behind it is there's actually kind of like it looks like a big plus sign if you look in the middle, where you see two what are called axes cross each other. So you have a y-axis and an x-axis. And what's kind of interesting is this is a type of math that you're going to see for quite some time now. But for fifth grade, since it's new, what we tend to do, or not tend to do, this is what we actually do as far as tests go, or as far as test purposes go. We only do any or all of our math that involves coordinate grids only come in what's called quadrant 1. So it's this quadrant that's kind of up and to the right. And really and truly when it kind of boils down to it is we don't do anything with negative numbers in fifth grade. So we're all about positive numbers. And so negative numbers don't really start up until you hit sixth grade. And so quadrant 2, quadrant 3, and quadrant 4 are actually out in fifth grade. It's not that they're not important, it's just that we don't use those because those would be involving negative numbers. So the next page that I go to is actually what you would see on a fifth grade problem, and really it's just kind of this quadrant 1 kind of blown up. All right, so on this page you're looking at quadrant 1. So again, you're thinking about that plus sign from the previous page, but instead of those other quadrants, you're only looking at quadrant 1. So this is kind of like a blown up portion of that grid. Let's talk about a few things that are important. These are some vocabulary words that you're going to need to know. They could pop up on the STAR test. First off, the two axes that I mentioned earlier, I'll kind of just draw arrows to them. So this one that's running up and down is your y-axis. And so that is just a straight line that kind of runs right in the center of a coordinate grid. And so sometimes on test questions they might refer to the y-axis. You need to know that that's the one that's going up and down. The one that's going left and right is the x-axis. So I'll put a little y and x here. Again, it's going to be running left and right, and again, kind of splitting it in half if you were to be looking at all four quadrants. But again, we just kind of have to think about, all right, this is still just quadrant 1. This is the one that's up and to the right. And so this is where we need to put our focus on it for fifth grade. There's one other really good word here that sometimes will pop up, and that is actually it's a number. It's this 0 that's down here, and I'm just going to draw an arrow to it. This is what's known as the origin. So the origin is kind of like the starting line. That word origin, a lot of times it's where it's coming from, and so where it maybe is beginning. And so when you are working ordered pairs, basically that is your starting point. You're starting at the 0. So a lot of times I like to refer to ordered pairs as a board game. And when you're working ordered pairs, a lot of times it's kind of like, okay, well, if I'm playing a board game, there's kind of always that starting position on the board game. And then maybe you roll the dice or whatever you might be doing on your board game, and then you move forward. Well, it's kind of like this for ordered pairs. You always start at the 0 or the origin, so that's your starting line. Basically, what we do with this in fifth grade, we do several different things with this. But one of the main ones that it's kind of like a good intro into ordered pairs is learning how to plot points on a coordinate grid, or learning how to label or read points that are on a coordinate grid. So I'm going to show that a little bit on this screen, and then we're going to move on to some of the other pages. So basically, what's going to happen, and I'm going to switch over here just to get a little bit bigger dot. So what's going to happen is you might see points on a grid, and when you see those points on a grid, that is what's known as an ordered pair. There are two numbers, that's where it gets its name, ordered pair. There are two numbers on this grid that coordinates its location, basically. And so your job is to know, if you see a point on a coordinate grid like you do now, to know what that means and how to go and to label those points. And it kind of works vice versa, and we'll kind of go over everything that you need to know. But I've got 5 points on this grid now. Probably the first thing that we're going to talk about is how to go and label these points. This is going to it's kind of weird. It sounds strange, but I bet if you stick with me through the video, it'll make sense, and it'll be something that you can take with you, the rest of your time when you have ordered pair questions, because this is pretty easy, and this is something that always helped me. So I always tell my kids, we talked about board games a second ago. This is a lot like the game Battleship. If you've ever played Battleship before, you are playing Battleship on a coordinate grid. And when you place your ships and you call out your, A5 or whatever it is, and you either hit or miss, if you've ever played that game, you know what I'm talking about. Basically, you're playing it on a coordinate grid. And so there's a lot of similarities between that and this. Or kind of the weird one that I was mentioning earlier is, I always tell my students, you got to think like a baby. And I'm going to try to explain myself with that when we go and we label these points. Okay, so let's talk about labeling the points. So I'm going to switch my pen color here because we're going to go label these points. So this is what I mean by you have to think like a baby. So when you start these out, you're going to always start at the origin. So I'm going to circle that. And when I circle that, this is kind of where the baby thinking is going to come into play. So what you have to do is you have to start at the 0. And when I say think like a baby, when a baby is born and it's starting to grow up and develop, it's going to learn to crawl first. And then after it gets really good at crawling and moving around on the floor, it's going to stand up and walk. So if you are starting at the 0 and you think like a baby, you're going to crawl. You're basically going to crawl out. And I'm going to kind of show what I mean by this. So I'm going to kind of use my pen tool here. I'm going to crawl out. And then I'm going to then stand and walk to that point. So if I were to look at that one there that my arrow is by, I am crawling out to the 6, and then I am standing up to the 3. So in other words, I'm going to the 6 on the x-axis, and then I'm going up to the 3 on the y-axis. And if I wanted to label this ordered pairs are always in parentheses. And so I would label it 6, 3, and then I'd close up the parentheses there, and I'd have the answer of 6, 3. So in other words, I'm telling the reader or whoever made this, in this case, I did, but I know exactly where that ordered pair lies on the the coordinate 1 of this grid. It lies at 6, 3. And so it's kind of strange, but if you can remember that, that's always a big help. You got to think like a baby. So you got to crawl first. So you're going to crawl on the x-axis, then you're going to stand to the y and get your second number. So I'm going to go get a couple more of these just for practice. I'm going to go maybe to these 2 in this area here. I'm going to circle them so you can kind of stay with me. So I'm going to crawl to the 2 and then stand up to the 5 for the first one. So I'm going to label that 2, 5. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to crawl to the 2, but now I'm going to go up to the 9. So this is going to be 2, comma 9. And then I'm just going to keep going. So I'm going to circle this next one. This one's crawling to the 5 and then standing all the way up to the 12. So we've got 5, 12 on that one. And then I'm going to crawl to the 8 and then stand up to the 8. So this one's going to be 8, comma 8. And then close the parentheses. And then now I've got them all labeled. So the test, when you get to test questions, sometimes they might have points labeled for you. Sometimes that's your job, is to go and label the points and find out which ordered pair is correct. Here recently, it seems like on the last couple of STAR tests, they've really incorporated ordered pairs with like shapes. And so what they might do is they might have, like a trapezoid drawn in on the inside of the coordinate grid, and then they might want to know, well, what's the ordered pair inside the trapezoid? Well, again, as long as you can label your ordered pairs, your dots or your points, then you should be fine on questions like that. That's really easy, and I always tell kids this is one of the easier lessons that we get into, because really it doesn't involve a lot of operations. So there's not a lot of adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing, stuff like that. This is pretty easy stuff. Okay, this particular grid is already made. And so I am just going to go through this, and you can kind of walk through it with me for practice. Only this time, instead of writing the labels on the grid, I'm going to write them out to the side. And you'll actually kind of see what I mean by this. I'm going to put them into a table. Because a lot of times when you're looking at ordered pair questions on the test, or potentially some of the other stuff we're going to get into this week, it will show up in a table format, and you're actually going to see that on the next page with me. So I'm just going to do this pretty quickly. I'm going to come out to the side, and I'm going to make just a quick T-chart. And on the left side, I'm going to label that my X value, and on the right side, my Y value. And what I'm kind of practicing here is, this is a good way for it to show up on the test as well. Your X value is always your first value. So in other words, it's your crawling. So if you're thinking like a baby, you're crawling to that number. And then your Y value is your standing. You're standing up to that value. And another way to always kind of think about it is when you're labeling these, if you were to, say or recite your ABCs, X always comes before Y. So your your X value is always first, followed by your Y value. Okay, so let's just kind of go in order here. Let's start with the A. So this one's kind of interesting. This one sometimes is a misconception. So if you start at your 0 here, I'm going to circle the 0, or what's called the origin. Remember your vocabulary. If you think about it, you're not crawling at all. So sometimes kids get that confused, and they're like, well, I thought I had to have a number there. Well, if you don't go anywhere, then you're stuck. So you didn't crawl at all. So you're at 0. So my first value over here is going to be 0. But then if I go and I stand, it's going to stand to the 6. And so I've got my first ordered pair over here as 0, 6. Okay, so that one's done. I'm going to put little check marks as we finish them. The next one, I'm going to crawl to the 2 and then stand up to the 8. So I'm going to come over and label that as 2, 8. That's pretty easy. All right, that one's done. Let's go ahead and go to D next. It's next in line, looks like to me. So I'm going to crawl to the 3 and then stand up to the 4. So that's 3, 4. Check, that one's done. Let's do E next. I'm going to crawl to the 5, stand up to the 2. So I've got 5, 2. Or then the last one, I'm going to crawl to the 6 and then stand up to what looks like the 7. And so I'm going to have 6, 7 here. And something that I tell my kids to do, even if it's in a table format like this one, it might still be good to practice putting parentheses around them, because, you just never know how it might show up on a test. And so it's just good to do that. Most of the time, if it's in a table, it won't have parentheses. But your answer choices might, so you just never know. All right, on this last page, I thought we'd still practice a little bit only this time, what I thought we'd do is kind of go the opposite direction. In other words, what I'm going to do is I'm going to write some ordered pairs in a table. And if you're looking here with me, you'll see there's two types of tables. There's what's called a horizontal table and then a vertical table. And that's something that will throw off kids. And it really is just, it's a little bit of a change. But it's still the same math. The math really is the same. It just looks different. And so they like to do that because they like to try to trick students on the test. So for this particular one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to write in some ordered pairs on the table first. And then from the table, we're going to take it and we're going to go graph it. So I'm going to start, and I'm just going to start writing in some here. So I'm going to do 0, and then 3, and then 1, and then 5, 7, 4, and then 2, 0. So those are going to be those in red. And I'll tell you what, let's do this. Let's switch colors, and let's do some over here for the vertical. So this kind of looks like what we just got through doing on the previous page. So again, I'm just making some up as I go. 0, 5, 3, 3, and then this goes all the way up to 15. So I'm going to do a 15, 7. Okay. So let's start with the red. I'm going to switch back to red here. I'm going to get a little bit bigger dot. So all I'm doing here, excuse me, all I'm doing here on the horizontal table is I'm still thinking about that as that is still an ordered pair. That's a point on this grid over here. So 0 is your X, and then Y is 3. So this would be one where we're not going to crawl. We're just going to basically stay there, go up to the 3, and we're going to put a point or a dot. And so those are kind of tricky. You got to be careful with those. All right, the next one says 1, 5. So I'm going to crawl to the 1 and stand up to the 5. Good. All right, next one's 7, 4. So I'm going to crawl to the 7, then go up to the 4. Looks pretty good. And then this one also has a 0, but I've switched it. So this one now is I'm crawling to the 2, but I'm not standing at all. I just basically stay there on the x-axis. And so watch for those. Those are ones, again, that can get kind of tricky on you. All right, I'm going to switch back over to the blue. I've got my 4 points from a horizontal table. Now I'm going to go to the vertical table. So I'm going to go to 1, 2. So there's the first one. The next one's 0, 5. So I'm not going to crawl. I'm going to stay at the 0. I'm going to go up to the 5. I'm getting them all kind of bunched up here. 3, 3. Looks like somewhere in there. And then I did one all the way out to 15. So I'm going to crawl to 15 and then stand up to 7. And so somewhere kind of right in there looks like 15, 7. Excuse me. So really, all we're doing here on this video is we're just kind of going over some basics. These are some basic skills for ordered pairs. They could ask you lots of different ways on an ordered pair question. They can, you know, like I said earlier, they could throw in some shapes. I've seen them put this into a word problem. I think the biggest thing that you just need to be able to do from this video is to be able to label ordered pairs, or to take them from a table to a graph, or a graph to a table, kind of like we've done a couple of times now. So I think if you practice these, you'll probably agree these are pretty fun and these are pretty easy.